Welcome to Learning Principles 3. What is prompting? In this presentation, we're going to define prompting for you and look at some different prompting strategies. We'll talk about how to fade our prompts, how to shape new behaviors, as well as define for you what inadvertent prompting is and how to avoid it. So how do you get the child to answer correctly and learn a skill if you're trying to teach something and the behavior is not happening? Oftentimes it's not that the child can't learn, we just haven't figured out how to teach it yet. So before we look at prompting, let's understand a little bit about how we behave or how we respond to certain things. When we talk about stimulus control, we're talking about behavior occurring in the presence of specific stimuli as a result of prior reinforcement. So if you think of your phone ringing, you answer your phone when it rings because of the prior history of people talking on the other end when you answer it. That's why whenever the phone rings, you answer it, unless you know that there's a telemarketer at the other end. Now, our children with ASD may have challenges when it comes to using skills functionally and responding to cues in the environment. So usually when we're first teaching, a certain amount of prompting may be necessary. So if a child is unable to respond correctly and independently to a tutor, parent, teacher, or educational assistant, we might provide some assistance to help the child. The assistance that we give is referred to as a prompt. Now what's important to remember here is that a prompt is only a prompt if it works. It needs to evoke the correct response. Remember the behavioral contingency we talked about in Learning Principle 1 about reinforcement? When trying to understand the behavior of individuals, we consider three things. What happens right before the behavior, which is the antecedent, what the behavior looks like, the topography, and what happens right after the behavior, the consequence. When you have an antecedent, response, and a consequence, that's referred to as a behavioral contingency. So when we're looking at prompting, an individual might provide a child a prompt right between the antecedent and the behavior. So right before the behavior occurs, you want to help the child so that they respond correctly. Here's an example. The teacher tells Johnny to go to his desk. That's the antecedent, or the instruction that's given to the child. And the teacher also points to Johnny's desk. That point or gesture to Johnny's desk is a prompt, so that Johnny knows which desk to go to. If Johnny follows the instruction, that's the behavior, and goes to the desk, and then the teacher gives him a thumbs up, that's the consequence. So the antecedent is the instruction to go to the desk, the prompt is the point to the desk, the behavior is that Johnny goes to his desk, and the consequence is that he gets a thumbs up. Now, why do we prompt? Well, in order to increase the independence of the child and to help them learn the skill as efficiently as possible. The other reason that we prompt is to minimize errors. It's important to minimize errors because 1, they take up a lot of teaching time, 2, they can increase the chances of further errors, and 3, it can increase frustration with tasks. Think about it, nobody likes to make mistakes, right? So what are the different types of prompts that we can use? Well, there are verbal prompts. Verbal prompts are words, instructions, or questions that direct a person to engage in a target response. They're used pretty often, but one thing to remember is that they can be difficult to fade, so be careful of using them too often. In terms of prerequisite skills, in order for verbal prompts to be effective, the child needs to understand the language that we're saying. So if I was to say, Johnny, go ask your friend to play, and then say to Johnny, say, play with me, the child needs to understand what that means. The other types of prompts are modeling prompts. This is when we show the child what they need to do. These prompts are used often as well, and can be done in person or through video modeling. Prerequisite skills for these types of prompts are that the child needs to be able to imitate. This is called generalized imitation. If they can't imitate what you're doing, a modeling prompt is not going to be effective. There are other types of prompts as well, manual or physical prompts. This is when there is physical contact from the instructor. So these prompts are used often and with a variety of different tasks. They are fairly intrusive, and so you should be fading them to a less intrusive prompt as soon as you can. Gestures or points, motioning or nodding to correct answers. These prompts are less intrusive than the manual prompts. And you can also use visual prompts. So photos, checklists, written scripts, signs are all visual prompts. You likely are going to need to use different prompts for different tasks and different students. So a prompt that worked really well for Johnny might not work well for Sarah. So you have to use a prompt that's effective for the child that you're working with. Here are some different types of prompting strategies. You could use most to least prompting. With this strategy, you start with a more intrusive prompt, a manual prompt, and then you gradually decrease the amount of assistance that you're giving to the child. So maybe you've moved from a manual or hand-over-hand prompt to just a model prompt. Another type of strategy is the least to most prompting strategy. Here, we start with a less intrusive prompt, so we may start with a gesture, such as a point, and then we increase as needed. So if a point doesn't work, then we would go to a hand-over-hand or physical contact prompt. Now this strategy provides more opportunities for the child to respond independently, but can also produce more errors. Another strategy is the delayed prompts. So here, we gradually increase the amount of time between the instruction and when we deliver the prompt. What's important to remember here is you need to be careful because the child could simply learn to wait for the prompt and become prompt dependent, and we don't want that. So you'll need to consider what prompting strategy works best for your child. We just talked about prompt dependency, so what does that mean? Well, be careful. Prompt dependency is what happens when the child has learned to respond to the prompt instead of the cue that's supposed to evoke the response. We want the child to be responding to the question and to the antecedent, not always to the prompt. This is why it's important to fade. Now, a prompt must eventually be removed. Remember, our goal is always for the child to respond independently. So we need to do prompt fading. By decreasing the assistance that we're giving the child, we increase the child's independence with the task. So we need to transfer the stimulus control from the prompt to the natural stimulus, or the antecedent. So basically, fade your prompts. A skill is only mastered if the prompts can be removed and the child can respond to the instruction independently. It's important to fade physical and intrusive prompts, things like manual guidance and gestures. It's also important to fade yourself. So for example, if you have an EA who's working with a child and they're always standing right next to the child to prompt the child, it may be at some point necessary for the EA to take a little bit of distance. So increase the distance between you and the child when they're able to respond more independently. Now, of course, safety is always our #1 priority. So stay close enough that the child is safe. Remember, prompting will be necessary in the beginning and with certain tasks, but they should be used carefully in order to be effective and to bring about more natural responding. Fade your prompts carefully and gradually. If you fade them too quickly, the child may start to make errors. If an error occurs, simply go back to the last successful prompting level and gradually decrease your support again. Now let's talk a little bit about shaping. What do you do if you want to increase the behavior of a child, but the child never emits that behavior? You could use a procedure called shaping. Shaping involves the reinforcement of successive approximations of, or increasingly closer attempts at, the desired behavior until the desired behavior occurs. So if a behavior occurs once in a while, or a part of the behavior occurs, then it can be strengthened by following it with a reinforcer. So let's give you an example of shaping. Let's say that your goal is for the child to say, "I want juice." Now right now, the child is only able to say ooh. So where we might start is we would accept this and reinforce the child whenever the child says ooh, and we would give them juice for ooh. Then gradually up the ante, and you only reinforce for those closer attempts. Once you've established the child requesting juice by saying ooh, your next step might be teaching the child to say oos, because that's closer to juice. So the child says oos and gets the juice, but no longer gets the juice for only saying ooh. Once the child is saying oos consistently and getting the juice, then we up the ante again to teaching the child to say juice. Now the child gets juice only for saying juice and no longer gets it for saying oos or ooh. Next step is teaching the child to say want juice. And our final step is the child only gets the juice once they say I want juice. And then we no longer give them the juice for just want juice, juice, oos, or ooh. Lastly, we want to talk about inadvertent prompting. Now, sometimes we might unknowingly provide an inadvertent or accidental prompt to a child. Let's say you're wanting the child to identify a picture on the table. So you would say to the child, show me the dog, but you accidentally look at the picture of the dog. This is called an inadvertent prompt. So you're accidentally prompting them. They could be looking at you, looking at the picture of the dog, and they're responding not because they know what the dog is, but because that's the one you're looking at. So a couple of ways that you can avoid inadvertent prompts is to 1, look at the child when you deliver the instruction rather than at the materials. 2, maintain a neutral facial expression. So don't start smiling right away if they're going to the right answer. Wait until their response is complete. And 2, keep your materials organized. One question that often comes up is, when do we reinforce? Is it still okay to reinforce the child if we had to prompt them? Yes, it's okay to reinforce. You need to start somewhere, right? So when you're first starting by prompting a child, we want to reinforce them. We want to let them know that this is good, they're responding well. However, we should begin to provide less reinforcement for prompted trials eventually, and provide more reinforcement for the responses that are more independent. Remember, our final goal is always increasing independence. So when prompt fading begins, when we begin to provide less and less prompts, the reinforcement shifts from the prompted trials to the ones that are more independent, the unprompted responses. Thank you.